name is Paige, and I am part of the Deschutes Public Library, and we are here as part of the library's virtual programming. This entire month, we are exploring timber. And of course, I thought of our brilliant Ponderosa Pines, and we have here tonight a doctor of trees, Dr. Rebecca Franklin from Central Oregon Community College. She is going to lead us through a wonderful presentation all about our beloved Ponderosa Pines and other amazing Central Oregon trees. All right, our presenter tonight is Dr. Rebecca Franklin. She is an assistant professor and the Forest Resources Program Director at Central Oregon Community College. Trained in dendrochronology and forestry methods, Dr. Franklin has devoted years to teaching others going into the wonderful field of forestry. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen so I can start showing you some pictures right away. All right, so what you should see right now is the full screen shot of my first slide. So yeah, welcome to the No Timber series. And like Paige said, this is one of the first trees that pops into mind when we're here in Central Oregon is Ponderosa Pine. And of course, we're going to give a little bit of attention to Western Juniper, but we're going to focus on our beautiful, large, old, tall, massive Ponderosa Pine for the majority of this time. So before I get into the really cool details about Ponderosa Pine, I'm just going to kind of set the stage for a lot of the other series that are going to follow this and talk a little bit about what a forest ecologist is and what a forester is, and a little bit about their background and what they do out in the woods. So if what is a forest ecologist, they study the science behind the interactions between, the living parts of the forest and the non-living parts. So the non-living parts would be, like the atmosphere and mineral soil and the weather and fire, and the climate, and the living parts are all the trees and the soil microorganisms and the plants and the animals. So that's what a forest ecologist would do. And so we'll differentiate that from what a forester does. So a forester is a person who takes that forest ecology science and really applies it out in the field. They go out there and they figure out how to get the forest to respond to some sort of an objective. And oftentimes we just think of like timber production, industrial timber industry maybe. And that's one thing that foresters do. But a lot of what the foresters do here in Central Oregon is, making our forests safe or resilient in regards to fire. So they work with fuels reduction, or they might create good wildlife habitat like you see in this old black and white image of Eastern Oregon, this Eastern Oregon area near the old town of Whitney. So wildlife habitat, fuels reduction, fire safe forests. Also, where these forests have streams running through them. So riparian restoration is another objective that foresters would be interested in, and how to create forested habitat and riparian habitat where all these streams run through our forests, because that's one important product of the forest is fresh, clean water. All right, so forest ecologists sort of inform foresters. Foresters try to apply that knowledge to figure out how to get the forest to, produce the objectives that we want. And then we get down to kind of where the rubber hits the road, and that's where loggers come in. So, loggers aren't just folks who cut down trees to make timber or to make board feet and to make, 2x4s. Loggers are a huge part of creating this, open, fire resilient kind of park-like conditions here on the east side and in Central Oregon. So, we really rely on folks who have logging equipment to create, areas where we can reduce fuels that, can cause these destructive fires. So just forest ecologists, foresters, and loggers are all really important when we think about how to manage our forests here in Central Oregon. So when I was putting together this talk, I just kept coming back to the word superlative, and I kind of just gave a little subheading of my talk as a tale of superlatives. And so superlatives, it's just kind of a term that sort of like denotes the highest level of comparison. So the most, the best, the biggest, the greatest. So a lot of these superlatives can be applied to Ponderosa pine, and I'm just going to show you a little bit of data, and this is the only time I'm going to like throw a bunch of numbers and scientific names at you. So one of the superlatives that can be applied to trees in the Pacific Northwest, I'm going to step back a little bit, we're going to look at trees in the Pacific Northwest, and that is old trees. So we have a lot of the oldest trees on the planet here in the Pacific Northwest and, in the Western US. So this is just sort of a top, couple dozen, the very oldest trees that we have here on the planet. And I've just highlighted in yellow all of the ones that are here in the Western US. And, we have these 5,000-year-old bristlecone pine, and there's giant sequoia and Sierra juniper. And then, we kind of come down this list and we see, oh, our Western juniper is on the oldest trees list. And then I'll come down here, Ponderosa pine is on the oldest trees list. And if you're familiar with different tree species, or you've heard these before or hiked through them, you'll recognize a lot of these names. So this is one of those superlatives that we can apply to trees in our neck of the woods, the oldest. And you can see this list is all of the trees that are like older than 1,000 years. There's nothing magical about that number in particular, but it's just, a number that humans recognizes. That's really old. So we have really old trees here. We also have super tall trees here. So this is just another list, and I love compiling, lists of numbers and looking at metrics like these. So our tall trees list. So a lot of these are kind of out towards the coast where water availability lets those trees grow really tall, and there's enough water to suck up really, really, really high. So we have our coast redwood and our coast Doug fir, over 300 feet, almost 400 feet for the redwood. So another superlative, the tallest. And then actually our Ponderosa pine makes the list, almost 270 feet, a Ponderosa pine down by Medford. So we're on the list. Both of these lists are Ponderosa pine lands on them. And then one list where trees in the Pacific Northwest really dominate is these giant, massive trees. Okay, so they're a lot of the taller ones, but these trees also grow large in diameter. And this measurement right here is just a volume measurement. So giant sequoia down in Central California, 55,000 cubic feet. And, if you've ever kind of handled lumber, you might know what a board foot is. And so a cubic foot is 12 inches by 12 inches by 12 inch. So a cube, a foot on each side of wood. So giant sequoia has 55,000 of those. And then, we have coast redwood and red cedar and Doug fir and sugar pine and Sitka spruce, massive trees. And then, oh, yep. And our Ponderosa pine is on the list again for almost 4,500 cubic feet of tree, in one tree volume. And so, we can think about, put it in a practical lens. So a logging truck carries about 3,000 to 5,000 board feet. And so remember, this is cubic feet. So cubic feet is, about 10 times as much wood as a board foot. So we really have this massive selection tall selection and old selection here in the Pacific Northwest, which is, wow, that's kind of almost coincidental. They're all here with us in the Pacific Northwest. So you might wonder why would all these big, tall, old trees be here? Why are they all here in the Pacific Northwest with us? Well, it's because we have, and this is a question that scientists, they don't have completely figured out. So we have a lot of rainfall sometimes, we have massive droughts sometimes, and then we have fire that comes through, and we have severe growing conditions. We have high mountains, and those mountains can be very dry. And so basically what you see is a lot of variability. So all of those superlative trees grow in areas that are very, very extreme, and they handle a lot of variability. And so scientists think that, those massive trees to have survived millennia upon millennia of variability in rainfall, drought, fire, they need these reserves. And so that's why they think, these most massive trees grow here. And then the extreme conditions that we get to see. So Central Oregon, we'll kind of look at some of the places where these oldest and tallest largest Ponderosa pine, oldest juniper, they're extreme, and they're very dry. You get not a lot of moisture. So here's this bristlecone pine that's found in California. It's grows at over 10,000 feet in elevation, and there's under 10 inches of rainfall, maybe 6 inches of rainfall in some of these places per year. And so these severe conditions lead to long life for these trees. There's not a lot of fungus, not a lot of fungal attacks that these trees have to weather. There's not a lot of fire that spreads in these very sparse environments, so these trees can grow a long time. So all of these harsh conditions lead to all of this, these biggest, tallest, oldest trees. And also very wet conditions can lead to very tall trees. So a severe environment gives these, superlative tree descriptions. But, regardless of the reason, the Pacific Northwest is a fantastic place to be. And just for example, from my house, and maybe likely your house, if you're here in Central Oregon, within 15 miles as the crow flies from my house, I have the oldest Western juniper on the planet at 1,600 plus years old. And then I also have the largest Ponderosa pine, at 4,400 cubic feet. So just right close to home, we have these magnificent trees, and they occupy these extreme environments, and so in some ways they're similar, but some ways they're very, very different. We have this fire resistant Ponderosa pine, it's so tall, and then we have juniper, not fire resistant and not very tall, but super old. So we do have magnificent trees close by. And before we launch into our investigation of Ponderosa pine, let's just take a little sidebar and talk about Western juniper. It's the tree that Central Oregonians sort of love to hate, right? So here we have Western juniper, just some details about the scientific name, Juniperus occidentalis. So that's what the botanists refer to Western juniper as. And so this is a range map for Western juniper here in red. And as recently as 2006, we used to kind of lump all these juniper together, but then the taxonomists, they're always separating plants and renaming plants and making things a little bit difficult for me and my students. But so recently that Juniperus grandis, or the Sierra juniper, was put into its own little group. But, so Juniperus occidentalis, our Western juniper. So this is the range. This is sort of the natural range of Western juniper. And, at approximately 1870, this was sort of the distribution of juniper on the landscape. And they had been in this kind of configuration since about 3,000 years ago, kind of occupying this space on the landscape. And then from, the last 150 years, those juniper have kind of been encroaching into the sagebrush steppe because of fire exclusion and grazing. And we've had, in the early 1900s, it was a little bit warmer and wetter than it had been in the previous centuries. So that all kind of was a perfect storm for juniper to encroach into areas where it historically hadn't been. But this is the native range, and we have a 1,600-year-old juniper sort of smack in the middle of this range here, and then here's a cross section from Frederick Butte, and that's close to the geographic center of the state and where the largest juniper is. And you can find that on some old Forest Service maps. But this sample right here, 700 years old, and you can see the beautiful sort of lobate growth of juniper. It's quite a gorgeous wood that this tree has. And this is that Sierra juniper. We're pretty familiar with our Western juniper, but Sierra juniper is a little bit different growth form, and a gorgeous tree on the Sierra Nevada landscape in that granite sort of rock background there. So really beautiful tree. So that's the distribution of the juniper. So let's get back into our featured tree, the Ponderosa, and let's look at a map of the range of Ponderosa. Okay, so those taxonomists, they like to classify things into finer and finer categories. And what we consider our Ponderosa pines here in Oregon are two subspecies. Here in the drier kind of Rocky Mount, or the interior mountains here, we have Pinus ponderosa subspecies Ponderosa, and this is that largest Ponderosa that's down in Lapine State Park. That's this subspecies. And then the oldest Ponderosa, I don't know if you were looking at that chart that I put up and looked at how old that oldest Ponderosa was. Well, it is 1047 at the time it was dated, but that tree is over here in the east slope of the Cascades in Washington. So, harsh, dry, pretty severe climate yields a really old tree. So that oldest Ponderosa is here, that most massive Ponderosa is in Lapine, and then out here in Medford, there's another subspecies, and it grows a little bit in little wetter conditions, and so it can get taller. So that's where the tallest Ponderosa pine is, out here near Medford, and that's that kind of different subspecies right there. And then you have the Washoe subspecies here near Tahoe, and then there's this sort of plains or Rocky Mountain Ponderosa pine, and that's out here. And it's kind of, this is the distribution. This is where you find Ponderosa pine over its range in North America. And these different colors are, the scientists have found different mitochondrial DNA signatures in these different groups. So that's how they kind of divide those up. And, you might notice there's this sort of donut pattern to where Ponderosa pine are located. It's kind of another mystery that scientists think about, is why are Ponderosa kind of in this ring around the Western US? And there's this kind of blank spot in the middle, and they think it might have to do with seed dispersal by animals after that last glacial, the last ice age. So, there's even with a super common tree like Ponderosa pine, there's mysteries that we're still working on figuring out. And that range and the distribution of the tree is one of those mysteries, as is why are all the biggest, oldest, tallest trees right here in the, Pacific Northwest. So that's the range map. So let's zoom in a little bit and look at more of the actual tree. And so here's a really beautiful illustration of a lot of kind of common features of Ponderosa pine. And I know a lot of you are able to identify Ponderosa pine. And so we'll look at some of these characteristics, and then we'll get into what I think is a really interesting question. How do you find the old growth Ponderosa pine? And then I'm going to end the presentation with information on my 3 favorite kind of hot spots for the really beautiful old growth Ponderosa pine, and I've organized them by season. So fall, winter, and summer, the best places to go get these old growth Ponderosa pine and go find them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the bark and the leaves and the cones briefly, and then we'll get into the bark, that beautiful orange bark that kind of represents the old growth that we see, and then how to pick those out on the landscape and where to look for them. So let's zoom in and check out these leaves. And a lot of you are familiar with that sort of adage of bundles of 3. Ponderosa pine has, you can identify it by bundles of 3 needles. And yeah, that's correct. Sometimes you get 2. In drier, harsher environments, you get needles or bundles of 2, kind of out in the Rocky Mountains and the plains, kind of in North Dakota, South Dakota. They have Ponderosa pine with fewer needles sometimes, but basically here in Central Oregon, we can look for those long needles of 3. And then if you zoomed right in and you're interested in the details, you can check for this persistent papery sheath around the fascicle. That's a unique characteristic on our 2 and 3 needled pines. You can see that papery wrap, and it's really pretty. These are brand new needles, and that kind of fine white papery wrap is a really pretty thing to look at. So we have our needles, and then we kind of zoom out and we can look at the cones, and they are egg-shaped, like a super large goose egg, maybe up to a couple inches bigger than that. But the cones are egg-shaped, they're orange. And then what you can really check for, if you want to make sure it's a Ponderosa pine cone, are these little prickles at the ends of the scales. And then you can kind of look and you can see this diamond-shaped, we call it an umbo, but it's the end of that scale. And it's really, really unique to pines, that genus Pinus, Pinus ponderosa. All those Pinus trees have these kind of thick umbos at the ends of the scale. So there's all sorts of clues that can help you identify plants out there. And they're very, very specific tree by tree. And all the pines have this sort of cone shape, and then Ponderosa and some other pines have a prickle on the end. And you can kind of look at that. And people say prickly Ponderosa as a way to kind of identify that, because those prickles are outward facing. And then we can also look at this gorgeous, gorgeous bark. And this is this orange platy bark, sort of develops when the tree's about 100 or 150 years in age. So the tree develops these deep fissures and these large orange platy structures there. So these are some Ponderosa in the Willamette National Forest. So, we do get Ponderosa over on the wet side of the Cascades in some places. And you can get that orange bark there too, not just over here near Bend. And then you can kind of like start gazing up into the tree, and I'm going to start kind of talking about old growth Ponderosa pine now, and kind of what to look for to recognize it on the landscape. So really big, thick branches. So Ponderosa, when it gets old, it gets that orange bark, and then it gets those large, thick branches. And Ponderosa pine susceptible sometimes to mistletoe. Dwarf mistletoe is a natural part of the forest, and it can cause some branch deformations, but they end up being good for wildlife and give it that characteristic gnarly look of that old growth. So here's what that crown might look like in an old growth tree, really large diameter branches. And then if we kind of took a closer look at the bark, this is a picture I took of a piece of bark that I picked off of a tree that has long since passed, but it had survived some fires. And what I want you to look at right here is this bark that's, several inches thick. And that's a great characteristic of Ponderosa pine. It's very fire resilient. So some of these trees are fire resistant. They they don't die when fire comes through. And partially that's because of this really insulating bark. It prevents the part of the tree that's right under the bark, that growing layer of cambial cells, from getting too hot and dying. And you can kind of compare the thickness of Ponderosa pine bark to this little juniper section I have in the background here. And that has really thin bark, and juniper doesn't survive, you know, repeated fires at the base of the tree, but Ponderosa pine can. So it has thick bark, and then it also has these really, really cool pieces of the bark. They're kind of like, they almost look like puzzle pieces. And whenever I'm at an old Ponderosa pine, I pick one or two of these little puzzle piece segments off and look at them because they're really neat to play with. But when there's a fire that's sweeping through the undergrowth of a Ponderosa pine stand, these little puzzle piece bark segments reflex, and they, in response to the heat, they kind of flex out and they pop off of the trunk of the tree. And when they pop off and fly away from the tree, they also remove some of that hot, like the heat from the trunk of the tree. So it's another way that Ponderosa pine prevents, you know, mortality in its, you know, in its species in response to fire. So these puzzle piece bark segments popping away also protects it. And so you might end up with something like this. So, so this is a Ponderosa pine. This is one of the ones out in Colorado, kind of showing you something from the other extent of the range. And you get this sort of cat face fire scar in trees that have repeatedly survived low intensity, frequent surface fires. So that's something Ponderosa pine are historically well known for, is surviving these multiple fires that come through. And, you know, now in the last 150, 200 years, we've started putting out all the fires. We extinguish them, and, you know, a lot of this fuel grows up in the background and sometimes leads to catastrophic crown burning, you know, forest consuming fires, mega fires. But in the past, when these frequent fires came through every so often, you know, just the fuel, the litter layer would burn up, and you might get scarring or repeated scarring. And then fire ecologists can go in and take a little section out, and they can date that section and figure out how frequently fires came through. And they might have a whole laboratory full of samples that look like this. And they get to see one of the most beautiful parts of the tree, I think, which is this. And this is the wood anatomy of Ponderosa pine. And you can see it's very, very simple, but very, very beautiful. And there's only a couple of types of cells that we have here in the cross section. So on this edge of the picture, if you kept going, you'd hit the bark out here. And on this edge of the picture, if you kept going, you'd hit the center of the tree. So that's kind of how these rings are oriented. And we can see in this section right here, you know, this might be half a centimeter, 1/10 of a centimeter, you know, across. And you see these tiny little files of what are called tracheids. So there's this kind of cell, and then we get resin canals that grow when this part of the tree is, you know, right under the bark. It'll produce resin canals, and that has pitch that prevents, you know, fungal attack or insect attack. These resin canals are a defense mechanism in the tree. And sometimes if you see a bunch of resin canals in your tree, it means that tree was under some sort of stress, and it was producing a lot of resin canals to, you know, withstand some sort of pathogen. So you have these tracheids, and then you have your resin canals, and then sometimes there's these long kind of cross-sectional long cells here called rays, and those rays transport, you know, waste products and metabolites, and they kind of deposit all that stuff in the center of the tree and create a really strong core that's full of properties that keep that tree upright, strong, and resist decay. So beautiful wood anatomy Ponderosa pine has, and because scientists can zoom right in and they can kind of see exactly how wide these rings are, and they compare ring widths in multiple trees, and they take cores and they look at these ring widths, and they can assign accurate dates to every one of these rings. And they have methodology that allows them to precisely date every ring to its year of formation. And so that really cool feature that was initially kind of worked out with Ponderosa pine. Ponderosa pine is one of the original trees that we use to figure out how to date trees, and I figure out how to date them going back in time hundreds of years. And then when you get a sample that looks like this, you can, using those cores and kind of cross-referencing them, those precise dates are going to give you precise fire history information. And that is one of my favorite things that we can figure out with Ponderosa pine. And in this sample, I'll show my students a sample like this, and I'll have them calculate how frequently fires burned at this site. So this is a site in Arizona. So that's another place we have Ponderosa pine in the Sky Islands of Arizona. And all of these little notches in here are little fire scars. And so, we have 1606 is the birthday of this tree. And we see all of these fire scars. There's actually 34 different fire scars all along here up until about 1869. And that was the last fire scar this tree recorded. And then we started putting fires out. The settlers who came through didn't want anything to burn. They didn't see fire as a useful tool that, many people who've lived here in the Western US, Native groups, Paiute, and folks that live here, in Central Oregon, they've been using fire and living with fire for millennia. But, settlers started putting those fires out. And so you get this sort of rind of no fires. And so if we do the math and we think about, this 263 years of history here and those 34 scars, on average, you have a fire happening every 7.74 years. So at this site, our fire return interval was at least happening every 7 to 8 years, maybe even more frequent, and it didn't burn this tree, but at least that frequently, which is amazing. Some places have less frequent fires, up in our higher elevation Ponderosa pine near Mount Bachelor, you might get 20 years between fires naturally up there. So, in wetter places, we don't have as frequent a fire history as this. So, maybe down Eastern Oregon up over to Bend, that might be, about a little over 9 years. Was one study that they investigated that fire. So it's a really cool, one of the cool things about Ponderosa pine is it's just a phenomenal recorder of fire, climate, precipitation, temperature. It's a great scientific tool. So let's get to some practical information for you guys if you're out there looking for really old trees. We want to know, where are these really old trees? So let's kind of look at two of these trees right here. So they're both old trees. This is an old tree. It has that orange bark. It has some big branches, but I just want to point out the top of the crown of this tree has a pointed kind of apex, right? It's still kind of growing up and it's pushing up in height, and trees do that until they get as tall as they're going to get, and then they start growing out laterally. So if you want to see the really old trees, you're going to be looking for this sort of like flattened, flat top look, okay? And so this tree, this is the tree, and you might even recognize this tree. I actually saw it today driving back from a friend's house out near Horse Butte. It's at the top of Horse Butte, and it has a really characteristic look, and that flat top. And this one's not very tall because there's not a lot of water here, so this tree can't pull that water up very high. So it's staying short, and it's okay. It's hanging on. It's experiencing a lot of dieback on one side, it looks like. But so this is a really old tree. This is an old one. This is a really old tree. So this gnarled branch, flat top, not a cone shape. This is what you look for when you look for those trees. So I'm going to share with you my top 3 old growth Ponderosa pine spots. And I have them organized fall, winter, and summer. So no matter when you're hiking, you can hit a really great area. So for the fall, this is my favorite site. And you'll see at this place, it's going to have massive old growth Ponderosa on the very, very, very driest edge of where they can possibly grow. There's a ton of old growth juniper out there as well. And it is Dry River Canyon. So this is east of Bend. You go out Highway 20, about 20 or so miles, and it's a little bit east of the Oregon Badlands Wilderness, and that's a federally designated wilderness out there. And this is if you're a geology nerd, this is an awesome place to go because there's phenomenal geology story out there, and you can read about that. But if you go and hike along this canyon, in the very bottom of the canyon, you will run into massive old growth Ponderosa pine that are, they are suffering from a lot of drought stress. And so they're beginning to wane out there, but they are gorgeous, beautiful old trees with that classic old growth look. And this is seasonally closed for raptor nesting and reproduction from February to August. So that's why I go there in the fall. So a beautiful hike. There's rock carvings out there that are only a couple hundred years old, and just a variety of plant diversity that's a little bit different than the surrounding area. So that's my choice for fall. And now we're getting into winter. So there is nothing as pretty as Ponderosa pines in the snow. And we kind of don't associate Ponderosa pines with cold, snowy conditions, but yep, they tolerate some snow. They don't grow in the very, very coldest sites, but they do grow where heavy snowpack accumulates in the winter, and they rely on that snow melt in the summer. It has a overcast sky in the background, but my absolute favorite Central Oregon scene is snow, orange old growth Ponderosa pine, and a blue sky. That combination of colors is amazing. And where I go for my winter old growth fix is Meisner Snow Park. And that's up the Cascade Lakes Highway, about 12 miles. And you can snowshoe, you can cross country ski, you can skate ski, but just even the main highway, they call it. It's a wide ski track out here, the tangent loop. And it's wide and it's flat and it's easy to do on snowshoes or skis. You will come across right in here gorgeous, massive old growth Ponderosa pine that is just phenomenal in the winter. It's it's not the best in the summer, but in the winter, this is a knockout spot for old growth Ponderosa pine. And then for the summer, so my top spot for the summer to go and check out Ponderosa pine is one of the highest locations, highest in elevation, that the Ponderosa pine grow here locally. So this is the road to Edison Butte. Okay, and so here's the Cascade Lakes Highway. It's about 22 miles up the Cascade Lakes Highway, and then you take a turn down. It's called Road 45, but it's the highway that goes down to Sun River. And all along here, starting at Edison Snow Park and kind of going south a little bit, like I would say this section right here, and you can just pull off the side of the road, and there's Jeep trails that you can actually drive a two-wheel drive vehicle on, and dirt roads, and you get into areas that are just, I mean, beautiful, beautiful Ponderosa pine, and it's higher elevation, so you get different shrub communities. There's a different kind of understory here than what you would find out at, for example, Dry River Canyon, that fall site. So yeah, so this is a nice place to go in the summer when it's hotter down in Bend. It's nice and cool up here. And you get the Ponderosa pine are a little taller because there's more moisture and they can pull that water up higher. And you can find this. This is my personal favorite tree out on this road right here. It's kind of near, it's right near the paved road, and it just is such a classic. And this picture, I don't have a person in there for scale, but this is a massive tree, and it's just such a classic. It has that flat top that old growth have. It has this, dwarf mistletoe infested gnarly branches down low, and it has that just beautiful orange bark. So my favorite tree is out there, and I'm sharing that location with you. You can drive through and just look at those beautiful, beautiful trees. So yeah, so those are my top 3 spots and a little bit about Ponderosa pine and why I love that tree so much. And I hope you're able to think about some of those things next time you're out and about locally, or anywhere from Arizona up to Washington. Thank you.
I was curious. I have had the pleasure now of working with you and hearing your story and just hearing the passion in your voice and the excitement that you get at talking about this amazing subject. How did you get started talking about trees? How did you get started studying this?
Well, I was when I went to college, I wanted to find the classes that would get me outside. And I liked plants. I started out in botany, but then I realized all the forestry classes had outdoor labs. So I switched over because I wanted to go outside and I wanted to be able to have some sort of hands-on involvement with, the forest outside. And then I was just interested in older and older and older trees. They were just the really cool ones. And, forestry back in, 2000, when I was in forestry, a lot of people were still interested in, timber production over everything else. And I was sort of interested in the science and what the tree history could tell us about the environment. So I found out that, you can study that. You can take cores out of trees and you can find out how old they are, and you can figure out everything in the life of a tree that went into forming how it grows. And I found a place to go to school where I could learn more about that. And yeah, as part of graduate school is you got to teach. You have to teach classes. So I got pushed into it, and it actually ended up being pretty fun, and it's something I'm excited about. And so I'll bend anyone's ear about trees and where to go to find them, and like the best and biggest and oldest, and the history that they can give us. So yeah.
That's fantastic, and we really appreciate it, because I love how you framed the history of an entire region within a single tree. Like you were talking about the fires and all of this information that we can get from a single tree can tell us so much about the world in which we live. And I think that piece was something that makes me feel small, which makes me feel, I think it's good every once in a while to feel a little small.
Yeah, but you have all that knowledge, and it's so powerful to know about that stuff. And you can feel small, but you can be part of a big story.
Exactly, definitely. So Ponderosas are one of my favorite pine trees. I grew up in Montana, so they're everywhere. They're kind of ubiquitous. I've taken them for granted in the past, but I was curious. You've given us a lot of information today about specifically how fire resistant these ponderosas are, and you mentioned how when fires get going and the tree starts getting hot, it will pop off pieces of its bark, like little puzzle pieces. So I'm just curious, how does that, if at all, contribute to like the fuel of the fire? How do those bark pieces, are they left over afterwards? Are they that resilient? Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so it's just heat. So the tree's not on fire yet. It's just heating up, and a tree, for those living cells under the bark of a tree to die, they don't have to get to burning temperature. They just have to get to 40 degrees Celsius. And so the tree doesn't have to even burn. It just has to get hot. So the tree can, it's heating up, and that fire's burning nearby, and it's burning close. And so those pieces of bark start getting hot, and they expand, and so one side expands a little bit more than the other, and it pops off, and so that hot bark lands out in the fire, and it might get consumed, and that fire might dry down or burn down. And so it takes a little bit of the fuel away from the tree, and it does. I understand your question, like, well, wouldn't that make a bigger fire with piles of bark? But oftentimes it just kind of, even before the tree burns itself, it kind of releases that heat a little bit.
Yeah. And a little piece of bark in comparison to a whole tree, nothing. Yeah. So, and is it true that Ponderosa pine cones actually, like that Ponderosas, in order to propagate, their cones need that fire? Is that myth that I once heard?
You're probably thinking of lodgepole. So lodgepole pine grow up in the understory of Ponderosa in some places here. And, we see them, they're all over. Sun River is kind of like a lodgepole pine forest. And there's different varieties of lodgepole pine. And our lodgepole pine here, those cones, they open up by themselves, but the Rocky Mountain lodgepole pine, they need fire for those cones to open and release a seed. But our lodgepole pine, even though they release seeds naturally without fire, if a fire does come through there, it kind of scarifies the seeds and promotes that sprouting. So seeds, all different plants have, criteria for the seeds to germinate, and fire, freezing and thawing, getting wet, getting frozen, getting roughed up by passing through the intestinal tract of an animal, and being scratched up and scarred up and heated by fire is another trigger. So that is a trigger for lodgepole pine to kind of germinate.
Awesome. Yeah. See, there's my Montana coming out again. So you mentioned at the very end, you gave us a great little tour of where we can go in all the different seasons to find these beautiful Ponderosa pines. And I know that the premise of tonight's talk was all about Ponderosas, and you have these favorite Ponderosa pine trees. And I'm just curious, are Ponderosas your favorite tree? Do you have a favorite tree? We've talked about all these superlatives. What are your superlatives? What's your favorite best tree?
Well, I do like valley oak trees in the kind of central California. Those are beautiful. I kind of grew up with those, so I have a soft spot for all those oaks. But a tree that I worked with a lot was Bristlecone Pine. It's on my list of it's a 5,000+ year old tree that grows in the mountains of Eastern California. And that's probably my favorite. And that's kind of where I started in on all of this tree ring stuff. And I, searching for the oldest samples, and I, have various samples in my office somewhere here that are, thousands and thousands of years old, and they smell good. They're beautiful. They have a big history, and they're awesome looking on the landscape. I had a couple of pictures of Bristlecone Pine at some point on all of those pictures, but that's probably my favorite. It's just living out there on the edge of what supports tree life.
Yeah. And speaking of tree age, I know that when I'm walking through like Shevlin Park, or I'm out on the trails, I see these big giant trees. And now you've told us about how to identify old growth, looking for the top canopy really spread out rather than that cone shape. Is there a way, looking kind of at the base of the trunk, that we could figure, like guesstimate, how old is this tree?
Well, it's tough because some trees can be really fast growing. and they might look old because they're really wide in diameter. But if you're in a space or a place where it's pretty rough climate, like it's really dry and it's really cold or it's really hot, and you see a big tree, chances are that tree is really, really old. If you're, over in the Willamette Valley and you see a big tree, it could be 50 years old and as big as some of our Ponderosa or old growth Ponderosa. So kind of knowing a little bit about the climate in this place where you're walking around and then combining that with what you see out there is probably a good way to guess. And then these old growth Ponderosa, if you look at that bark and you see that really orange, light, bright orange, and those really kind of like wide plates, from fissure to fissure, that's a good clue that it's an old tree. So that color.
Yes, wonderful. Taking a look around to see what other factors could be influencing its growth. That's great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. It's kind of like trying to guess jelly beans in a jar. Have to
Right.
take a look around to pick it up. Yes. How old do you think this tree is? Well, a few hundred. That's a safe guess.
Yeah. Some of those trees out at Edison, near Edison Butte are, 400, 500, 600 years old, some of them. So they're getting up there.
Oh, that's amazing. The scale and the scope of what you do is awe-inspiring, just seeing these trees and seeing how much of the history of our land that you can understand from it. And thank you so much for sharing all of this great knowledge with us as well.
Yeah.
So we can hopefully become stewards of the land just like you are.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with us tonight? Anything else that you forgot? Any last words?
Well, no, well, when you're out in the forest and you see some areas cordoned off or marked off or closed off because of timber harvesting, over here on the east side or in central Oregon, those timber harvests are likely almost 100% of them are fuels reduction projects, and what they're doing is trying to create conditions that support old big trees. Sometimes they do take out some larger diameter, 1 or 2 larger diameter trees to help support the work that they're doing. But the primary objective for this harvesting that we see here, especially along the Cascade Lakes Highway and, down kind of near Crescent and all of that is, we want to make a forest that can withstand fire and, be as beautiful as some of these old growth, forests used to be. So that's what the Forest Service is doing. And sometimes there's misconception because of a history of the Forest Service, doing clear cuts or, back in the 70s and stuff. But they have different objectives now, and fuels reduction and creating a fire safe forest is their prime objective here in Central Oregon. So yeah, just keep that in mind and stay out of their way. Don't ride your mountain bikes through the, under the timber harvester or the processor. Yeah.
Yes. Good advice. Good tips for everyone. And we have someone who just wanted to say thank you for a great presentation and that they learned so much. And I did as well. So thank you, Rebecca. This has been absolutely wonderful to get to host you. And we hope that you all out there enjoyed as well. Deschutes Public Library has amazing content, and it's all free and it's all available for you. We are your library. So we invite you to check out DeschutesLibrary.org for all of the books you could ever want on trees, as well as this program and all of our other great fun free presentations. And if there's something you can't find, our librarians can help you find it, and we can connect you with specialists like Dr. Franklin herself. So check out DeschutesLibrary.org, and I hope to see all of you again very soon. Thank you.